Welcome to Tony.at.12, and today I'm in conversation with a gentleman that most of you see at the pharmacy, but did you know that he not only comes from the Isle of Man, but also had a political background on the island? My guest today is Richard Corkill. Richard, thanks very much for coming on to the programme.
Good morning, Moramai.
Yeah. Now, let's start off with a bit of geology, because originally the Isle of Man, which we're going to discuss, was attached to Cumbria, and then it parted in the same way the Channel Islands parted from the European continent. So there was early occupation, I think, about the same time as the Channel Islands. And can you sort of think suddenly you wake up one morning and you're an island? I don't think that was the case, do you?
I'm not quite sure I can remember that far back, actually, but certainly as the ice age melted and sea levels rose,
yeah,
that's what happened.
Yeah, very much so. And in common with the Channel Islands, there's a Viking connection.
Well, indeed, there is a strong Viking connection. My name, Corkill, is of Scandinavian origin, and many of the names in the Isle of Man begin with C, and they have their origins in Scandinavia. So my derivation is from Torkill or Thorkitel, and Thor is in there. So a lot of names on the island are sort of from Viking origins as well. It's without doubt, you don't move 2 inches on the Isle of Man without actually seeing the impacts of the Viking occupation, as it were, which happened from about 850.
Yeah. And you said Thor was one of the names. Presumably, it's quite easy to work out who the locals are if they've got Scandinavian origin.
Yes, well, the way it is these days, about half of the people on the Isle of Man were born there, and the other half have come mainly from the UK and other countries, Ireland. But you only have to look at the phone book, and they are all quite similar, really. So yes, it's very obvious what a Manx name is to someone who grew up there.
Now, during the Viking time, the Parliament was established, and that's called the Tynwald.
Well, that's right, and it's the main legacy, really, to my way of thinking, anyway, that the Vikings have left. It's an open-air Parliament, or started off to be an open-air Parliament, and on July the 5th every year, we celebrate that, and we actually do have an open-air sitting, which is a great ceremonial event. Usually a member of the royal family is asked to preside, and the Queen has done on a couple of occasions. So it is a very sort of, well, it's a national day, but it's a coming together of all the history of the island on the one day. The Norwegians have the Alting, the Icelandic have the Althing, and ours would have been called the Tingvald, now known as Tynwald. And I mean, it wasn't democratic in those days. It was a question of once a year, the rulers would tell the assembled people what the taxes and the laws were going to be for the next 12 months. And that's what happens today, but it's arrived at rather more democratically, I'm glad to say.
Only on the basis that you vote the people in, I suppose, because once they're in, they're good for however many years they sit for. But
there's 5 years in the Isle of Man.
Yeah. So up until then, the Vikings are sort of in charge, and in 1290, Edward I invades. And do the Vikings actually retreat and leave, or?
Yes, it was a Viking kingdom up until really when Scotland and England were fighting against each other for supremacy, and the Isle of Man was a bit of a pawn in all of that. The Vikings were there until 11 or 1200, but they too were squabbling amongst themselves. But at the most stable period, the Isle of Man was just part of a group of islands called the Sudras, and that included the whole of really all of the Hebrides all the way up to Lewis, and some of the islands in the estuary further south. And the 24 elected members that the House of Keys has was at that time, the 24 was actually representatives from all of those islands. Today, there's only the one island. Well, there's the Calf of Man, which is not populated, but there's just the Isle of Man, and you know, it's quite interesting, really, because 24 members used to run the whole of the Western Isles of Scotland, and now we need 24 to run just one island.
Yeah, such is progress. Iceland slightly outdoes it in terms of the start of their parliament, but they didn't have the continuity that the Isle of Man has had.
That's correct. It's the Icelandic Parliament is probably older, but the Isle of Man celebrated 1,000 years of continuous parliamentary rule in 1979. So we're well into the second 1,000 years now, and I think people in the Isle of Man are very proud of that continuity. It forms a base for the whole of Manx life, really.
Yeah, it's quite an incredible length of time, isn't it? Eventually the Scots capitulate and England takes over, and that was for strategic reasons, or?
I think the Isle of Man's always been a strategic importance because of its location in the middle of the Irish Sea. It's important today for a number of reasons. You know, on the top of Snae Fell, you've got an early warning system. You've got Heathrow flights coming across, and the beacon is right on the top of Snae Fell. So the visibility from the top of Snae Fell, you can see all of the countries, Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland. You can see them on a clear day. So it was always strategically important, but the English crown eventually bought the Isle of Man for £70,000 or £80,000 from the Dukes of Atholl. It wasn't a straightforward event. It happened in stages in reality, but eventually the crown took control. But that was more to do with, in fact, preventing smuggling, and there was so much running trade that it was impacting on the UK or the English treasury.
Were the Irish sort of involved in trade and piracy and everything else? Because, you know, as you said, the Isle of Man's right in the middle, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. If you look at Dublin, which is also obviously Viking origin, this was just part of the Western approaches, as it were, along that side of the British Isles. It was a major trading sea route. And in fact, when they excavated in Peel Castle, which is on the west of the Isle of Man, they found a number of Viking coins, which they considered was probably like a mint. It was really, they were producing currency for that kingdom of Man.
That's incredible, isn't it? Yeah. Now, what about language? Did they have their own language?
The Manx language, of course, is Gaelic, and so although the Vikings have brought the institutions, the place names, the language is very much Celtic. And so if you look at language and culture, whether it's dance, music, all of these things, they are very much embedded in the Manx language, which is similar to Cornish and Irish and Scots Gaelic, probably less so to Welsh, but there are understandings in some of the words. Sadly, I'm not a Manx speaker, but if you look at the history of my family, my father was an English scholar. He taught English and knew quite a lot of Manx phrases. His father was bilingual, but his father probably struggled with English. And that's how it's changed. But there has been quite a revival in the language, and I was proud to be able to as an elected member, make sure that there were funds available in the education front to allow for the language to grow again. The last native speaker died, Ned Madrill, in the 1970s. But we do now have a primary school where all the teaching is done in the Manx medium. And the results have been quite astounding, because it quite clearly shows that children who grow up with English and Manx language then go on to do better with other languages.
Yeah, I suppose it's a question really that, you know, if a child is bilingual in any language, it means that their thought process presumably is deeper than somebody that's just reliant on one language.
So I think it was very important at the time that we invested in that cultural aspect of the island, because people were worried about losing identity. And language is very much that, of course.
Mm-hmm. Now, it became a British Crown dependency. I think it's, on my research, it was 1765. And at that point, you know, it was totally involved with the British throne, yes?
Yes, it was the Purchase Act, it was called. That's when the Isle of Man was purchased by the Crown.
Yeah.
And that was basically to stop the smuggling and take some control of what was going on.
Is it a similar Crown dependency to the Channel Islands, just in very general terms?
I think for very different historical reasons, we've ended up pretty much in the same situation. There is no written constitution. The constitution evolves by agreement with
So it's like Britain.
And the UK government. And so our relationship with the UK is very much the same as the Channel Islands. It's through the Ministry of Justice to the Crown.
So after becoming a British dependency, Crown dependency, in 1866, limited home rule. So that enabled you to carry out various functions, presumably without reference to Westminster.
Well, that was very true. I mean, the infrastructure and the island was changing a lot in the 1800s, mid 1800s onwards, because tourism in the Isle of Man was ancient and needed upgrading. And it was agreed that instead of all the taxes that being collected were all headed off to London, that the Isle of Man could actually keep some of its taxation to spend on things like harbours and infrastructure. And so the self-determination started to increase rapidly at that time. I mean, there'd always been an independent feel, because back in history, the English, when they took control, did actually want us to become part of what was then Cumberland, but that was resisted dramatically, and so the independence has grown. Well, it's grown in my lifetime, apart from history.
It seems to be an island of innovation. I'm looking, for example, at 1907, the TT motorcycle racing.
Oh yes,
I mean,
well, the TT is a bit like Marmite. You know, you either love it or hate it. And I mean, there is a sad side to it, and we hear about that in the news. But you know, it is an incredible event. It is, unless you actually see it and stand at the side of a road when a racing bike goes past at virtually 200 miles an hour on what are ordinary roads, you just don't appreciate it. And I've grown up with it, and you know, it's part of life in the Isle of Man. I remember sitting my GCSEs when I was 15 or 16, having to go to the town hall because the school was inside the TT course, and the racing was ongoing. And I failed my maths O-level because I was listening to Mike Hayward and Giacomo Agostini racing, I could hear them coming through the square in Ramsey, and I had my stopwatch to see who was winning. And I took my eye off the maths paper completely and failed.
Well, the timing was a sort of maths.
So there's three things happen in June: hay fever, exams, but more importantly, the TT races.
TT. But it must have brought an awful lot of money to the island over all those years, mustn't it?
It's a huge tourist event, and sadly it was cancelled in 2020, and it's been cancelled again this year. When I was in government, we had to cancel it during the foot and mouth crisis in the UK. Luckily, foot and mouth never arrived in the Isle of Man, but it was cancelled as a preventative measure. Prior to that, the Second World War had stopped it. But you know, it's incredible, really, when you see the development of bikes from 1907 doing 20 miles an hour, and they're now doing 200 miles an hour on the same course.
And lapping at 130 plus, sort of thing. I mean, it's just incredible.
If you can't do 130 mile an hour lap, you're not on the leaderboard. You're not on the top 12.
No. You know the story about Valentino Rossi, who MotoGP world champion. He went there one year just to have a go. He did one lap and said, "I'm not going to do any more."
I think, well, obviously he's a very professional, experienced rider, and it is a totally different type of racing. So short circuit races, they expect to fall off and skid across the gravel and get back on, or race in the next race. You have to race in a totally different way within yourself on the Isle of Man, because it's open roads and there's obstacles all around the course. The government makes it as safe as possible. There's a TT safety committee which goes to great lengths to keep the circuit, which is 37 miles long plus, as safe as possible. But at the end of the day, there's a limit as to what you can do. As a politician, I was always keen that was in place. But more importantly, visiting members of the public, tourists, I was always really, I think we had a duty of care to make sure that they rode safely when the roads were open in between races and during the week, and that they had a safe and wonderful time. So there are a lot of things happening, like the Red Arrows, and there's fairs, and there's all sorts of things go on in between time. It's a very busy week. Yeah, and
you know, I enjoy it. So there we are. Looking at the population in 2016, the census showed about 84,000, didn't it? Something like that.
Yes, I think it's above that now. It's probably about 88. Thousand. So that I mean, it's a big island, so it's been able to expand the population. So I know in 1960 it was less than 50,000, and the economy was in a bad place, and people were emigrating. A lot of people went to Canada and Australia. Average incomes in the Isle of Man about that time were 50% of the UK average. And some of the taxation structures that were put in place in 1960 were done really out of desperation to try and stimulate the economy. But it worked. And, you know, it's now quite a diverse and busy economy.
So it was a bit like the Channel Islands, from growing tomatoes and stuff like that up until the 60s. You then enter the realm of financial services and other high value businesses where, you know, people can earn a good amount of money and, you know, obviously apply their skills in a better way. Now, tell us about the Manx cats before we get on to serious stuff.
Well, you see quite a lot of them around. You also see quite a lot of cats that have got a stumpy tail where they've bred with ordinary cats. So they are known as stumpies. But the Manx cats, you know, it's a genetical mutation that has then bred. I guess a bit like the blonde hedgehog on Alderney. But you can always see them in, even if you're not close to them, because they stand differently. They have much longer back legs, and so their body is at an angle. They're not particularly good house pets, if you know what I mean. And but you do see a lot of them on farms and out and about.
Yeah, yeah. So, born a Manxman, your profession has been a pharmacist, but
Yes.
then in 1991 you entered politics. What made you do that?
Well, I often ask myself that question, but the whole process was a great privilege for me. And I had my own business. I'd worked hard to build it up, along with my wife, Julie, and things were going quite well. But when I looked around, I could, we'd had a bit of boom and bust on the island in the 80s, and early 90s. It was all seemed to be heading downhill again, and I was coming up to my 40th birthday. I suppose I was becoming a bit more aware of things. But what really got to me was how old the infrastructure was in the island. And previous generations, my father's generation, his father, they'd been preoccupied with serious things like world wars, and there wasn't the money around. But all of a sudden, because of financial services, banking, insurance, and there's also quite a bit of manufacturing done on the island, high value. The tax receipts were there. And so I thought, on the basis of infrastructure, I'd like to have an input into that, and started to talk to people in the pharmacy and on the doorstep. And the big thing that at that time that they really, really didn't want anymore was sewage outfall into the Irish Sea.
Right.
There used to be this huge cloud of seagulls in Douglas Bay ever since the Victorians put the pipe there. And so we were relying on a lot of Victorian infrastructure, and it was not fit for a purpose for a growing population. It didn't matter whether you looked at the hospital, the school buildings, the sewage system, the electricity system to some extent. All of these aspects all needed upgrading. And that's what I started to bang on about. And it synced with what people were thinking, because they voted for me, and I thank them still for that.
Yeah. Tell us about the Parliament itself, the Tynwald. There are two houses.
Yes, so every 5 years we have a general election, and 24 members are elected to the House of Keys. That's known as the lower chamber. So it's a little bit like the Westminster structure, because we also have an upper chamber, the Legislative Council, and they are a revising chamber. So legislation comes through the House of Keys, clause by clause. Eventually it gets sent upstairs for review. The Legislative Council, if they disagree with it, can send it back down. But at the end of the day, the 24 elected members will always prevail with what they want. And this is this is the aspect of changing legislation and changing the law. At the end of the day, primary job of a parliamentarian is to make sure that law is enacted, and enacted in a proper way and a secure way. The Legislative Council is put there by the lower chamber. They are all elected by the 24. So they tend to be long-standing politicians or people who've done well out in the community. It includes the Attorney General, who is a Crown appointment, but he or she does not vote. But they are there to give legal advice. So that works pretty well. Every Tuesday when they're in session, both houses are meeting at the same time in different chambers. But they're on the top floor, the Legisco, and House of Keys is on the ground floor. But on the middle floor is another chamber called the Tynwald Chamber, and that is just used once a month. And the special thing about this is that both houses meet together as one.
Right.
Not quite as one, but they all assemble together. And the president of the Legislative Council presides over both chambers. And this means that the speaker in the lower chamber in the House of Keys can have a voice and represent his constituents. But the Tynwald meeting, the once a month meeting, deals with policy decisions, budgets, and it's a debating chamber more than anything. And Tynwald will give its view as to what it thinks should happen. Now, after a general election, the first thing that happens is the speaker's put in place, the president is already there. Tynwald sitting as one body, they choose a chief minister to create a cabinet style government. And I was fortunate to have that bestowed on in 2001. It's a bittersweet moment because, the work starts straight away. But I had been Treasury Minister for 5 years before that, so I did know what was in store.
Yeah.
And that is a simple vote. Candidates are put forward from the floor and seconded, and it's straightforward fight, as it were, and the highest votes wins. But then the Chief Minister then has to go away and consult with all his colleagues and choose the cabinet to head up various government departments. And so there's 8 or 9 in the cabinet. And what happens is the Council of Ministers meets every Thursday, but everything they do and decide has to be ratified by Tynwald. Yeah. They always have to engender support from the other members.
So there is proper scrutiny.
Oh yes, there's a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah.
Some people would say the Council of Ministers have got too much power. Yeah. But I would always point out that at the end of the day, there's only 8 or 9 of them in Tynwald, and there's 24 members altogether in the elected house, and there's 11 upstairs. So, I mean, I've moved government motions that have fallen flat on their face, and Tynwald said, go away and think about this again, So, that's what you do, because Tynwald is supreme in its decision making. So it's quite fascinating, and of course, full-time job, really. Very much.
Does primary legislation presumably has to go before the Privy Council in the same way that it does here? Is that correct?
It's always a bit of a vague area. As the Council of Ministers, if you're promoting certain legislation, you would always obviously want to know what the UK view is first. And so you would get a sort of semi-approval from them in advance via the services of the Attorney General. But, private members' bills don't always have that. And they take their chances and it's up to, I mean, being quite nationalistic, the Isle of Man would see that as interference in their internal affairs. But obviously for external affairs, defence and things like that, then constitutionally it's, there's nothing to do with the Isle of Man. We make a financial contribution for our defence every year, and it's a business deal.
And the clue is in the word dependency, isn't it? Presumably, because it is more a dependency on defence and international representation than anything else these days.
So some of the politics are quite nationalistic, and it's more about pride in the island, and being independent and keeping the independence that we already have. Going to the next step of full independence would frighten quite a lot of people. But there are quite a lot of people who think that would be a good thing, and they have their voice, and people vote accordingly.
Now, the relationship with the UK is different to the Channel Islands in terms of the VAT aspect. How does that work?
Well, it is just a business arrangement, so it's
Yeah.
got nothing to do with constitutional matters between the Isle of Man and the United Kingdom. Although in history that there are some crossovers because of the way duties were applied. Um, Now, it's a business agreement with 6 months' notice can be given on by either side, but it suits both parties. It may not one day, and there are those people who think it might not at the moment. But it's a sharing mechanism. So people in the Isle of Man pay VAT on goods and services. It goes into a pot along with the contributions from the United Kingdom. And then it's shared out on an agreed mechanism, which is basically on a population proportion, although there are some adjustments for tourists and temporary populations during the summer, but it's shared back out again. And so the latest count, I think it probably accounts for about £340 million of revenue to Isle of Man government. That's about a third of their tax income, I would think. And it's a very important contribution to services that government produce.
But the UK gets
it's always under review. It's not a static thing.
No.
Because the economy changes, tax rates change. The downside is that it means the Isle of Man has to accept, under the terms of the agreement, the tax rates, the level of VAT, for instance, at 20%, that's set by the UK Chancellor.
Yeah.
But there have been some variations within the agreement. So, for instance, renovation of property and hotel accommodation is set at 5%, which is different from the UK. But it's based on the fact that you can't smuggle a hotel room into the UK and you can't smuggle a renovated building into the UK. So they feel comfortable with that arrangement. What's
the rough split then between the contribution? You know, how much does the Isle of Man get and how much does the UK get?
I don't know the latest calculations, but it used to be about 1,000th or 1/1200th or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's quite important for businesses on the island because there are some manufacturing businesses that are high value and they produce parts for British Aerospace, for parts distribution in the UK. And they make parts that need to be out of the island by 5 o'clock at tea time.
Yeah.
And they're in the UK the next day, ready for possibly distributing to Heathrow to be fitted to a plane, or and so to have any customs barrier or paperwork that's not necessary would probably impede those companies, possibly to the point where they might relocate. And it's quite interesting, really, when you see, since Brexit's happened, you know, the whole customs thing is obviously in the news now.
Yeah. Presumably, they get VAT relief, these companies as well, do they?
Well, what happens is it's just like your input tax you claim back.
Yeah.
And then you charge the customer the output tax. And if
so
they're VAT registered, they can claim it back.
Yeah.
Not all of the money that is collected goes into the sharing mechanism. So it is quite a complicated agreement. And it evolves, but it suits the UK not to have another customs frontier to worry about.
Yeah, sure. So I mean,
there are benefits in both directions. Although some of the anti-lobby would say that it suits the Isle of Man, you know, more than it suits the UK. But you know, they're pretty sharp. I just don't believe that. If it didn't suit them, they'd soon let us know. Very
briefly, because we're running out of time. Any lessons the Channel Islands could learn from the Isle of Man?
I think what all the Crown dependencies should do is communicate more often and better, and COVID has been an example of that, particularly with Guernsey and Isle of Man with the Aurigny Air Bridge, which was great for me from a personal point of view while it operated. I think transport is an area that Channel Islands could learn from the Isle of Man about, in the way that we've regulated transport in the Isle of Man. We used to have a user agreement for the ferry service, which, although it was sort of seen as a monopoly service, it kept them in line and didn't make too much money out of the taxpayer. And we've always had an open sky policy for airlines.
Yeah.
So I think there is scope there to learn. There's no doubt about it that the islands compete against each other. And I think probably other people use that to their advantage, perhaps against the islands. So more communication would help in that way. Constitutionally, I'm not an expert, and I wouldn't dare to say that I know enough about the Channel Islands. But as an outside observer, who now lives on Alderney and has done for 5 years, looking at Jersey and Guernsey, they don't seem to have yet completely separated judicial matters from parliamentary matters. There still is this overlap with the bailiff, and although it seems to work, I just think from an ideal point of view, I would, as a former parliamentarian, I would always like to see the Parliament having more control over its own matters.
Proper separation of powers.
I think so, but it may well work in a way that I don't understand. But to the outside looking in, it doesn't look normal. Richard,
thank you so much. It's been very informative. Great pleasure to talk to you. We've learned a lot, I'm sure. And we'll probably have to have you on again some future date. So many thanks.
We've covered a long period of history in a short time.
We certainly have, yeah.
I've enjoyed talking to you, Tony, as ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you.